Welcome, everyone. My name is Camden Hutchison. I am the director of the Center for Business Law, and today's event is going to be our first live and in-person event of the semester. It's entitled Working as In-House and External Counsel to the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. And our speakers today will be discussing working at and with the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation, which is one of Canada's largest institutional investors with a $250 billion portfolio. BCI manages diverse investments for 29 British Columbia public sector clients and employs over 25 lawyers, often working with McCarthy Tétrault LLP as outside counsel. So I'm just going to give our four panelists very, very brief introductions in the interest of time. We have a limited time slot. So first we have Neil Markovitz, who is the Vice President, Tax and Finance at BCI. We have Maxime Doyle, Counsel, Legal Affairs at BCI, also a graduate of the UBC Law School. We have Kimberly Brown, who is a partner at McCarthy Tétrault, and Maureen Gillis, also a partner at McCarthy Tétrault. So without further ado, I will let our panelists start the presentation.
Okay, I'll use this then. Okay, people can hear me. Actually, one correction. I'm just the vice president of tax at BCI. We are actually recruiting right now for a vice president of finance. If any of you have coming from an accounting background and have decided this whole law school thing isn't for you, then you could do that. The other thing is I'm not just here to talk about BCI, which I work for BCI and I'm happy to talk about BCI and I plan to talk about BCI, but wanted to talk about the pension. What's up? Oh, so you need me to go up and sit up there? I can take one of those chairs there. Okay. That's fine. I can do that. So, yeah, work for BCI, but I'm familiar with the pension world in Canada in general. And since some of you may have dreams of working in the center of Canada, at some point you may want to work for one of the other organizations, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Oh, that means I have to grab the clicker. Hold on a second. I guess you guys have all been introduced. So I promised you guys a story that I didn't tell you about. I went to law school at Queen's, but I remember when I went there, the first day, the Law Student Society gave us these T-shirts for Queen's Law, and there was a top 10 list on it. I don't know if you guys, how familiar you guys are with top 10 lists, but that was a big thing back then. And it was top 10 reasons I went to Queen's Law School. And I have never forgotten number 10, which was didn't want mountains, ocean to interfere with my legal education. So a number of us, I think, kind of missed that part of law school. So anyway, here to talk about BCI. I'm the VP Tax. I've been there for, it's coming up on 9 years this February. Before that, I was at a fund of funds, infrastructure fund, credit fund business in Toronto called Northleaf for about 7 years. Before that, I worked at PwC and Deloitte in Toronto and also in London, UK. And then before that, I articled at Gowlings. And then before that, I went to Queen's. So why would we want to talk about public sector pension investing in Canada? Well, basically because there's a bunch of reasons, and I'll sort of give you why. But basically because it's big. There's a lot of it going on. It's a pretty large employer of lawyers in British Columbia and actually around the country, not just lawyers working there like ourselves, but lawyers doing work for us. And that's not just here. We work with law firms all over the world. The Canadian pension system, the Canadian public sector pension system at least, is somewhat of a world leader in this area. And has been doing this for a long time. And I'm going to talk a bit about that sort of as part of this. And as part of what they're doing, they have, like I said, they have a fairly sophisticated investment program. It's a global investment program. We have offices across the world. Our peers have offices across the world. We have a lot of need for lawyers. We have a lot of need for in-house lawyers. We have a lot of need for lawyers working outside the firms. And the work, at least to my mind, certainly from a tax thing, and I think legal would say as well, is fairly interesting. I mean, it's fun when you have a lot of money to spend and deals to do. And part of the fun of it also is, you sort of If you're like me and you're not really that into sort of getting into the detail on this stuff, but kind of enjoy sort of the more sort of overall policy and strategy stuff, you also have lawyers to hire. You can do some of the other work, and you can really work with them and kind of be in some ways the bridge between them and the rest of the organization. And McCarthy's is one of those sets of counsel, and you guys have done a lot of work for us in the last number of years, sort of including an enormous reorganization that we just finished, which was a fantastic success. You didn't get invited to the curling party, though, did you? So, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have said anything. Yeah, so yeah, it was actually an enormous reorganization. It was $32 billion, and it was about 180 assets that had to be moved around to find a way to accommodate our clients. So I'll start by talking a bit about BCI. So it's one of Canada's largest institutional investors. Has anybody ever heard of the Maple 8? Is that? Oh, okay, just Camden. Anyone else? Okay. I think we're being a little more kind, and now we're calling it the Maple 10, but because it really just started with an article in The Economist about sort of 10 or 15 years ago about Canadian pension plans and the investments that they make. So the ones that they named are in Montreal, public sector pension plan, which invests the money for the the federal public sector. So if you work for the CRA or the military or the RCMP, that's your pension plan. The other one is the Caisse de dépôt et placement de Quebec, which is CDPQ, which is invest the Quebec public sector money, and not just pensions. Some of them, like including BCI, don't invest pension money. In Ontario, there's Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which is kind of the pioneer in this space. They're kind of the ones who sort of came up with the Canadian model that everybody else, including BCI, over the next number of years copied. There's something called HOOP, which is for hospital employees. There is on OMERS, which does municipal workers in Ontario. Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which is kind of like the mother of all of us. It's huge. It's about, I don't know, 600 billion now or something. And basically every time you get a paycheck from anywhere and you see that CPPIB money, the CPP money coming off, it goes to them. And they've got to find a way to invest it, and they buy stuff all over the world. And I kind of always imagine that there's just a hole in the wall somewhere in their office somewhere, and there's just dollars flying in, and they're just trying desperately to shovel them out as quickly as they can. And then I probably haven't covered everybody in Ontario, but in Alberta, there's Alberta Investment Management Corporation, which has actually made the news a little bit lately for some stuff going on there, keeps making the news. And then BCI, which is based in Victoria. And why are we based in Victoria and Vancouver? Honestly, I think it's because that's where the provincial capital is, and the Ministry of Finance used to do this stuff until BCI kind of copied the Ontario teachers model it's back in the early 2000s. So you can see we have about $250 billion in investments. It's 29 public sector clients. I think that's wrong. It's more than 29. It's about 35. About 80% of the money is British Columbia public sector pension plan money. And then some of the money is ICBC's insurance reserves are with us, the workplace. So if Cam, you work here, so if you slip and fall on a banana peel on the way out and you make a claim, those insurance reserves will come from WorkSafe, which invests with us, and then a whole number of smaller clients more recently that we've signed up. All of them have a connection to the British Columbia public sector. One interesting one that's just brand new as of last month, which Kim also worked on, is it's actually called the Band Class Trust Fund, but it's overseen by a trustee called the Four Pillars Society, which is interesting. It's actually settlement money for residential schools in Canada. That settlement was a settlement agreement created, and they're responsible for investing that money. And one of the managers they've selected, we're happy to say, is BCI. So that was, and from a sort of technical tax perspective, which I promise not to get into, they were kind of interesting just because we had to think about exemptions that we get across the world. Now we had to think a little bit differently. Usually we're thinking about the BC public sector and pensions. Now we had a sort of whole new set of money, and we had to do some thinking about how that money would be invested. There's 4 offices that we have: Victoria, Vancouver, New York, and London. Our peers, some of them have more. People have offices in Hong Kong, in Sydney, and Mumbai. It really depends on which of the sort of peers you're out there with. So let me see what I put on the next slide so I can figure. Well, there you go. There's a whole bunch of them. There's probably 10 there. You can see. It would have been easier if I'd had this slide up while I was rattling these names off. These are people I know quite well, a lot of them, and certainly on the tax side. And Max, you probably worked with some of the lawyers. We co-invest on deals with them fairly often. We'll, like for example, we own part of the Chilean power grid. We own a sort of fairly large Chilean power asset, and we own that with PSP and CPPIB should be CPP Investments, it's called there. We own something with Ontario, the port. If you look sort of out to Vancouver and you see the big cranes out there in the water, you see Ontario Teachers and BCI own that together with an Australian fund. I can sort of go on and on and on. These are fairly large deals that it takes. So in those deals, it takes many months to do those, and they're quite complicated deals. So okay, here's more about our clients. You can see the list there. I'll give everybody a chance to read that and digest it for a second, and then we can go on. But you can see the reason that BCI looks like this and we're not a single plan is just because British Columbia's economy is smaller than say Ontario, so it made more sense to take all of them and kind of squish them all together into one single fund, which puts us on a scale with like an Ontario Teachers or some of the others. If these plans all invested their own money, which they used to do, some of them used to do it themselves, you have a lot less access to deal flow. If you don't, you have a lot less access to investment professionals, to firms like McCarthy's, if you're sort of doing this on your own. It made a lot more sense to pool a lot of this money together. So that's the model in British Columbia. That's the model in Alberta. That's the model in Quebec. But some of them, like Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, are so big on their own that they and for various reasons in terms of governance, they don't really need to be partnered with anybody else on it, sort of on a broader basis. So they don't do that. So okay, what do we invest in? Let's talk first a little bit about what I mean by the Canadian model, the Canadian pension model, and why this matters. So if you go back sort of 40 years, I don't know, you looked at Canadian pensions, they were very clearly in trouble, these public sector pensions. And the reason they were in trouble is because they were kind of, I mean, they still are in a way, kind of a pyramid scheme. And that sounds a little bit cynical, but that's not, but I mean, you have workers and then you have retirees. And if you need enough workers there to pay the benefits of the retirees. And if you don't have enough workers or there was not enough money there, you're going to have to do something. Well, Canada's population was young, it was growing, that was fine, that worked. That's actually probably why Quebec has its own, isn't part of Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. They thought, hey, we're younger than everybody else. Why don't we just have our own pension plan? We'll take the money ourselves. Of course, Quebec is now the oldest province, so maybe they're thinking that wasn't such a good idea 40 years later. So if anybody hears from Alberta, you might want to have a chat with the premier about that. But the model kind of worked. And the thing was, you didn't really have to invest in a very sophisticated manner. So, a lot of the money was in government bonds. I mean, the government would basically pay its public sector employers. It would then take the money, hold it itself, invest it in, it would borrow. It was, these governments have always had debt. And now you could just borrow, sort of Canadian, you could sort of borrow in Canadian funds and pay a little bit less interest than you'd have to pay on the open market, right? So the problem, of course, is that as the population starts to get older, people realize this was a problem. This was a problem for all of the peers, that at some point this was going to run out. Pensions were going to start to go belly up. They weren't going to be paying those benefits. And you imagine working for 40 years, expecting that you're going to have a pension at the end of it. And then suddenly you find out you don't have nearly as much as you've had. This is still the problem in a lot of American plans. It's interesting. I think of America as in many ways one of the most entrepreneurial countries in the world. Really, none of them have really at a large scale copied the Canadian model. If they did, this would be a very different world that Max and I work in. Can you imagine having like 100 competitors, new competitors in the US? It would just be a completely different thing. But Canada, well, what happened, and apparently it really is down to a few people at Ontario Teachers. I mean, there's more to this story, but they figured out, look, I mean, I think what they had started doing is they had started investing in more stuff, but then they were paying, as the American plans do, we're paying a lot of money to outside fund managers. Our CEO was talking with our clients a couple of years ago, and he said something interesting. He said, these, because we have a lot of fund investments as well, but I'll get into sort of why we do and what we have. But he said, with these outside fund managers, he goes, they come to visit us in Victoria, and you'll see their private planes parked, in the Victoria airport, because these people are extraordinarily well compensated. These are the masters of the universe that you hear about on Wall Street. They charge pretty high amounts to do this sort of work. What Ontario Teachers said was, why don't we do this ourselves? We don't have to pay, we're not going to pay people at Ontario Teachers amounts so that they have private jets sitting at Pearson Airport in Toronto, but we could still pay them pretty well. we can buy these companies, we can sit on the boards, we can do the value creation work, we can do all that work ourselves, and we can do it at a fraction of the cost. We can cut our costs massively, and we can, use that to basically help to continue to get the kind of returns, or start getting the kind of returns, because you're not getting cheap debt. I mean, things had already been moving that way, but start investing in more and more sophisticated asset classes. And so that's what they did, and they started it. They hired a guy, Claude Lemeroux, I think, was the original chairman of the board. There's a whole story there if you really want to read it. I think it's fascinating, but you can go and you can find out what Ontario teachers did. And I remember one of the first things they bought was the Leafs. I think they made a lot of money on the Leafs, but I think probably those of us who lived in Toronto would question whether it was the best investment they ever made. But, and now we have, I mean, sort of fast forward, the rest of the plans across the country kind of figured out this same thing, and they all copied Ontario teachers. And so now when you look at us, we have, in public markets, we have sort of a fairly sophisticated investment model. We have real estate all over the place. Our public markets thing, I think, doesn't really quite do it justice to sort of what's in there. But I mean, people are familiar with, what's the big one we're building on the Canada line? Oak Ridge, yeah. Anybody familiar with that big development that's going up at Oak Ridge? You'll see the name Quadreal on there. If you sort of go along where Oak Ridge Mall is now, which I think it used to just be a mall, and now it's turning into a major residential, quite a large project. Quadreal is actually the real estate arm of BCI, so they're building that. Like I said, we have mentioned at Power Assets in Chile, in Australia, in Colombia. We have a sort of cell network in India. We have stuff, forestry assets across in Vancouver Island. We have, fairly complicated assets across, but on real estate, you'll find stuff around the world that's actually owned or owned and run by Quadreal. Private equity. Anybody here like Korean beer and chicken chains? Anybody here ever even heard of this? Everybody heard of something called BHC? You heard of BHC? You look like you almost put your hand up. So, okay, apparently there's one in Toronto now, but when we bought it, it was just in Korea. I think it's doing pretty well, apparently. We own it with, like, Ontario teachers bought some of it off of us. On the infrastructure side, I just talked about private debt. We lend to stuff all over the place. Real estate debt is really just mortgages. And you can see that's, this is sort of what makes up all this stuff. We have internal asset classes mostly in Victoria, but a lot in London, a lot in Toronto, not Toronto, absolutely not in Toronto, a lot in New York as well, responsible for doing these investments. And when they need to do that work, they need tax help and they need legal help. And we don't do it ourselves, really, right? Like, I'm not, nobody sort of hired me to sort of think about all the ins and outs of Colombian tax issues, because there's no way one person could do that. So, whenever we do any particular investment, there's a lot of work involved in hiring someone like McCarthy's, hiring lots of other law firms out there, and then us kind of playing that role of understanding their commercial concerns. What are they worried about? They're worried about returns. They're worried about legal risks in terms of, things that Max can tell you a lot more about, like, sort of tag along rights and drag along rights. And, they're worried about getting consents from the Australian Foreign Investment Review Board. And these are not small projects. These often take months and months to do, and you have to get it right, but that means you need a lot of people there to do that. So that is sort of why this has turned from, kind of a sleepy area. I mean, it still sounds boring, right? It's pensions. To actually, I would say, what I've noticed in terms of tax professionals that I'm speaking with who are still working in the firms and stuff, it's kind of a sought after area, because people understand the work is going to be, fairly interesting in terms of deal flow, in terms of sophistication, in terms of the whole international aspect of it. And you get to kind of focus a little more on commercial stuff at the same time and kind of be that bridge. And so, it says that the slide deck is really about sort of, working for BCI here in, on Vancouver Island. We do have a Vancouver office, although I try and encourage my staff to come to Victoria. I actually insist on it, actually, because that's where, Victoria is a lovely place. Don't knock Victoria. But I really do, for people who are going into law, whether it's tax, whether it's anything else, you're going to find these, I think there's about over 2 trillion in the Maple 8 alone. And then when you add the rest of them, it gets all that much higher. You're going to find these players in your practices somewhere or other, as you go ahead. So whether you want to work in this space or whether you just want to be aware of it, it is, and depending on where you live and what you want to do, I really encourage people to think about it. So we're not going to go to thank you because we've got lots more to say. I mean, I can turn it over to Max first if you want to talk a little bit about what's like working on the legal side as opposed to tax. So,
Sure. So on the legal side, it's actually quite similar to the considerations Neil does deal with on the tax side. And it's bridging a lot of the commercial relationships between our deal teams and their investment partners. And then a significant piece is the regulatory side of things, like Neil mentioned. We're doing international deals that have different, legal traditions, uh, different areas of focus. So we deal with a lot of regulators, and explaining what BCI is, how they're structured, is a lot more complicated than anyone would think. And it doesn't always fit squarely into the other jurisdictions' models. We're not just a CBCA or BCBCA corporation. We're statutorily formed. We have one share held by the Minister of Finance, but that share doesn't have any economic or voting rights. We have a board. The board is statutorily prohibited from being involved in investment decisions. How do you reconcile that with regulators who are just asking for information about your ownership structure and your decision-making structure? So that's one, that's across the board. And as Neil mentioned, we just underwent a massive internal reorganization. I think we had about 20 different jurisdictions where we had to make regulatory filings. And so that's a big part, is being right in how we describe BCI and being consistent. The last thing you want is to make a filing one year, come back a few years later with a different answer, and then the regulator goes, what happened? Or were you right then? Are you right now? So that's a lot of what we do, is we work to achieve internal consistency. The other part is just helping our deal teams navigate the dynamics of a transaction. A lot of it on the private investment side where I work is those governance frameworks. We're not always aligned on every single issues with our investment partners. And so it's explaining, assessing risk, and working with our investment teams on how to achieve the best outcome for them. I think that's probably the easiest way to describe what I do on a day-to-day basis.
okay, before I hand it off to McCarthy's, I did promise you, I'm only going to do it if people remember. Anybody here remember the fast ferries? Anyone? Fast ferries, BC, fast ferries debacle. You remember that? Oh, wow. I never got to ride that. I'm only moved back to Canada. Yeah, because I think you guys wanted it, right? And trying. No, we would rather. No, I remember when we would drive the family to New York City, where I have family, and we're thinking how much nicer it would actually be to take the ferry from Rochester and then drive from there. But we never got to do it. It kind of came and went when I was living in London. Okay, well, we'll wait for an audience that remembers the fast ferry before I tell that story. So, all right. Oh, we had a question.
Okay, you have an audience. I remember it.
Why don't you, well, okay. So I wasn't here for this. I got here later, but BC decided to build these fast, I think they were like double hulled iron ferries that would go really quickly between Victoria and Vancouver. And they built them, but they had unfortunately failed to do all their research, because apparently these things threw up really big waves. And so much so, well, I was on Salt Spring Island. Anybody ever been to Salt Spring Island, Ruckle Point? You can stand on the rocks there. The ferry goes right past there. And my wife and daughters and my son, he was probably about 4 at the time, my daughter's a bit older, were standing on the rocks, and the ferry went past and they were chatting. And then a few minutes later, of course, the waves start washing up. They didn't want to get their feet wet, so they hustle back off the rocks. But my son, who was like 4, just froze and started screaming. He was terrified. So I'm thinking, you know, if if it had been the fast ferry, I'd have had to do like a free dive off the rocks into that freezing water to get him, because he would have just gotten washed out to sea. But thankfully that didn't happen because the fast ferries aren't there. The problem with the fast ferries wasn't just that they would have washed Oliver into the off Ruckle Point, is that apparently waves were so big they would have caused massive wave erosion, so they were never used. I think they were finally sold to scrap for some country in Eastern Europe or something. But so what does that got to do with BCI? Well, I remember I said, like, everybody kind of moved to this whole independent thing. And then Max talked about the sort of grand bargain that is BCI, with the clients having control of our board and us having control over the investments, and the government really not, you know, kind of sort of recognizing that independence. Apparently one of the things that had really scared the clients at the time was, what if they use our money to do something like the fast ferries and we don't have our pensions at the end of it? They were just sort of frightened by sort of bad government investing enough to want some independence from the government. So that's probably part of what you're actually seeing in terms of the tension right now in Alberta, is that the pensions there don't actually, our clients can actually fire us. Like, you know, our big clients, all of our big clients use us 100%, which makes sense because we're much lower cost, and because the government actually plays a role in guaranteeing to some extent a shortfall. But in Alberta, they actually have to use AIMCO. And so I think they're a little worried now that Danielle Smith is planning to start using people's retirement money to shore up the Alberta oil industry. That's the rumor we keep hearing. I don't really know if that's true or not. I guess we'll find out when Stephen Harper comes in. There were probably other reasons why they might have been upset with AIMCO, although I think everybody's a bit nervous about that one. It's really this kind of independence model, like all these plans. I mean, you've probably been hearing about sort of getting pensions to invest more in Canada. Everybody's quite worried about that because we've made our investment decisions based on the interests of our clients and on the interest of returns, and not sort of going back to the old days with the cheap debt, trying to basically backstop the Canadian economy. And I think that's sort of an ongoing worry that people are watching with Alberta. Sorry, now you've got the fast ferry story there, so now I can hand it over.
You want to start with tax or, okay. Finish strong with tax. So hi, I'm Maureen. I'm a business lawyer at McCarthy's. I do mostly M&A and private equity related work. I also do some work with large infrastructure projects and that sort of thing. So as you can see, the type of work that I do dovetails really well with what BCI does. When I was in your shoes, and I'm a UBC grad as well, I was not sure exactly what I wanted to do with my degree. I had the good fortune to go to McCarthy's, which does a lot of sophisticated, interesting work. But really, I feel like your progression as a business lawyer, in part, comes from kind of understanding what's going on commercially in the environment of your clients. And so I think just being here today and understanding what BCI does is actually very helpful to you. They're, as you're hearing, incredibly sophisticated and involved in all sorts of areas of the economy, both here and around the world. And you know, if you go summer article at a firm, you may be touching on this kind of work and sort of understanding what the interests and the mandates and the motivations of a client like BCI are is really important. I think for us as business lawyers, working with a client like BCI is really exciting. They're doing all these interesting, large scale, very complex and sophisticated projects, which gives us interesting work to do. And also we're working with, when we're working with clients like Neil and Max, they're, you know, people at the top of their game in tax and business law, working again in very interesting areas. So I think, you know, at your stage, I wouldn't have understood what BCI does and how important that is in terms of contributing to public sector workers' long-term retirement plans and how that's funded. But also understanding kind of the interaction. Like Max, you didn't talk about it, but you didn't start at BCI. You kind of went from private practice into to BCI. A lot of we actually have a lot of alumni of our firm at BCI. So as your careers progress, you may find you start in-house and then want to move into private practice, or you start in private practice and then want to move in-house. And so kind of understanding how, you know, how we work with clients like BCI and vice versa is helpful, I think, to you generally. Kim, do you want to talk about the tax side of things? Or your own experience?
Sure. Grab some pizza. Um, yeah, I think, I mean, start off and please jump in with questions. I guess I can talk a little bit about tax. Is anyone here in tax? A few friends. Okay. I won't go to, because I mean, for the rest of you, happy to chat about tax as much as you want. But I think for me, and I've got more of my recruiter hat on here, it's echoing what Maureen said, which is when I was a student looking at options, what are the things I wanted? I was into, you know, business law and tax. I wanted interesting work. I wanted to work with really smart people. I wanted to do cool deals. And also work in a culture that I felt was like kind of the right fit for me. And that's different for different people. So that ruled out a few things right away. And I think you get that, you know, with working with Neil, Max, and the rest of the BCI team. Here's a group that is in Victoria. As Neil says, it's a lovely place. I grew up there. But it's doing the really big sophisticated deals. And they're working with the top external law firms around the world. I count these some of the Americans and the others. And so, you know, they've got this law group that Mac's a part of that is seeing so much and doing the best deals. And the really cool thing is they're coming to the table with big money to spend. And what you'll see when you get into the cross-border deal work, unless you're coming to the table with big money to spend, you don't really have a seat at the table. So you kind of take the terms as, you know, the counterparties hand over. But here, you know, when you guys go to the table, people listen, you get to make the terms. And when, you know, Neil mentions, hey, we're buying a bridge in South America, you are not literally buying a bridge, right? There's so much more to it. So Neil and I will work together to help structure that deal, which is not going to be BCI buying a bridge. It's going to be some sort of terrible partnership under trust, under the corporations. There's going to be regulatory filings with that. You're going to be dealing with local counsel, but you're doing a cross-border deal. So there's a Canadian factor too, on your Canadian regulatory environment. So you're doing really cool stuff. You're dealing with counterparties that are very sophisticated. These are like the global investor players that you're interacting with, and you're getting to do that, you know, at different ages and stages, which I think is just really cool. So in terms of getting really interesting global experience across a variety of asset classes, getting experience working with, you know, law firms around the world at the top of their game, and seeing the counterparties who again are international players. These aren't sort of like local, you know, somebody else who you're competing with for a residential real estate sale. No disrespect to those. It's exciting, right? And when you're just starting out, that's a really cool place to be learning. And those are very cool deals to be on. You're doing it in an environment where you're working with people that have, you know, the experience both on the deal team as well as in legal and tax that you can really learn from. So I think that's, to me, what makes it really exciting to see what you guys are doing and working with you, because it's whenever I get an email or a phone call, I know there's something cool that's going to be happening. It's going to be really interesting. It's going to be hard, but it's also a really great team to work with. So that's my recruiting hat on. I'm happy to talk about tax, but any questions so far about that?
Maybe worth mentioning too, particularly if you want to practice in BC, and I know some of you may or may not, but understanding where there are larger legal teams, if that's an environment that you want to work in, is actually worth paying attention to, because if you maybe start in private practice and then decide you'd like to go in-house, and start looking at your options, there might be a lot of options out there where it might be just you as the lawyer, or just you and one other person, and where your scope might be quite limited. I feel like somewhere like BCI, having a large team, having diverse functions, having all sorts of different ranges of experience and different parts of what they do that you can learn, is a pretty unique opportunity. There aren't a ton of places in BC that have those opportunities.
Yeah, co-op applications are due, was it January 31st, I think.
Yeah.
please look that up and don't say Neil said it was January 31st and you find out it was the 28th or something like that. So, I mean, I'll go and try and help you if I say it wrong, but yeah, it's pretty sure they're due the 31st. We've had legal co-ops and tax co-ops, including tax co-ops who've come from legal, actually just met one of our co-ops this morning. She's working in tax, but she had actually worked with you guys, Miriam. Yeah. So super interesting, actually. She was a lawyer in Nigeria for a while, if you know that. So yeah, actually quite a neat person. There's, we've had co-ops for quite a few years now. It's a good experience. We try to, on the tax side, I mean, it's a little bit sort of more kind of mixed now, but we try to sort of make sure that people get some experience to the deal work that we do, as well as sort of, there's lots of kind of more sort of nitty gritty tax stuff. But the tax team really at BCI, we're sort of the Marines on a deal, in the sense that we have to get in first and figure out what the structure looks like and draw all those boxes and triangles and stuff the tax people have to do. Because until we've figured that out, nothing else can happen, right? You can't start sort of drafting agreements or figuring out all the other stuff. So that's always kind of the sort of pressure for us is get that part done first. And it's not always that easy. Working on something right now where one of my staff went to Hawaii. He has this habit of going to Hawaii right when there's he's got a huge deal going on, or right before, he knows that something's going to happen. We're going to buy part of the, sort of gas network in Czechia. And Simon's like, okay, I'm off for a month now. I'll see you later. So I'm supposed to be the boss. I'm just supposed to float around giving people instructions. But instead, I'm sitting beside the ski rental rack at Mount Washington, talking with a lawyer in London, trying to figure out how to structure some deal or something like that. And then Simon just comes back. So truth is, he does those deals when he's around as well. The problem is he's just really busy. But, he was gone again into Hawaii, and then he came back and he's like, well, did you think about this issue or that issue? And I was like, no. So I don't know. Somebody may have to do a little bit of extra flying on a particular thing, but I don't know. I still think I got it right. But anyway, point is, it is this kind of frantic period right at the beginning of a lot of deals where tax really has to get stuff done, I think, to on these things. So we probably throw it open to questions at this point, unless there's anything, I don't know, anything anybody else wants to talk about, or like I said, really just glad that you will. Thanks for coming, having some pizza, take some home for your friends. That we really just want people to, like I said, it really is an area you should be thinking about for the future, because it will, look to the right, if you look to the left of you, some of you will end up working in the pension space or for the pension space at some point. So
I'll just say on the co-op front, for those interested in looking at the job postings, it's, if you Google BCI co-op legal, it's on a Workday platform. It's actually the easiest way to access the page. We've got some description, the timeline. As Neil said, applications close January 31st, but we usually try to take a look on a rolling basis. We don't wait until it's closed and then look at everything at once. It kind of depends on how busy we are on a given day. If we've got a few minutes, we'll take a look at the resumes and cover letters that we've received so far. So if anyone's interested, BCI Co-op Legal, Google search. It's a Workday platform. That's the easiest way to get the job posting details. And I guess on that note, now we can open it up for questions.
not all at once. Oh, we have a question. You in the back. You want to go first? You want to go? Okay, I'm holding the mic. No, I did not. I articled, and then I actually have a brother who did the exact same thing. We both then went and worked in the Big Four after that. I worked there for a while before I went off into financial services. He's still at one of the Big Four many years later. He's a bit older than me. And no, I didn't. But what we both did, and I was just copying him because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So this is, sounds weirder than it is to have two brothers who are actually both tax lawyers. We're not the only ones. There are a few others floating around. When I was in law school, I actually did a credit in financial accounting, first year financial accounting, and got sort of credit for it in my third year. And you really, I found in tax, you really sort of having a bit of that numbers background is pretty helpful. It's been helpful for a lot of things actually. So. And then when I went and worked for PwC, although, I mean, they kind of hired me because they thought, well, he's a lawyer and he can write. I did do a lot of like tax return work. I kind of insisted on it, and sort of learned how to put financial statements together, not sophisticated financial statements. Compared to the actual accountants, I was very bad at this stuff. I think they were probably, would be the first to tell you that if you could go back and ask them. They had to be very patient with me. But yeah, over time, I did end up with more of that kind of accounting background, and I would say that was actually quite helpful in future years in terms of doing stuff. If you ever end up as the tax director of a like a public company or something like that, they don't care about the tax returns. They are glad that you know the tax law so they don't have to deal. The thing that they care about the most is probably the tax numbers on the financial statements. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with tax provisions before. It's a whole science of it's not science is maybe not quite the right word for it, but it's a whole thing on its own that involves a whole different way of thinking. Again, I was bad enough at it that I'm getting a stomach ache right now just remembering when I had to do it. But I was able to, I can, even now, the other day it came up, in fact, it came up this morning actually on a deal where I was able to just sound like I knew what I was talking about a particular issue that goes back to tax provisions. And so that was helpful, sort of all those years later. So did you have any accounting background?
Take this away now, and I'm going to go down a very different route to talk about my love of tax law. So I put my tax law recruiting hat on. No, I don't have an accounting background. I did finance commerce undergrad, but so in my world, and this is where we're gonna diverge our path a little bit, but not provisions and the mathy stuff. And no, thank you. I fell in love with tax in law school, actually, because it was my favorite law course, because it was grounded in a statute, which made way more sense to me than torts or property and the rest of it. Grounded in a statute with actual words that you could read. There's a rich body of jurisprudence that you could go through. You could actually trace through the decisions and kind of agree or disagree. There's this huge body of CRA administrative guidance, which I also disagree with 50% of the time, but that's fine. And so I just really liked that architecture of law. It made sense to me. I could sort of follow it. You could then kind of take what you've learned and turn it into kind of creative ideas or arguments that David Duff, indulged me in. So I went to U of T when he was there, so I was his student way back in the day. So yeah, we're now pals, but he was my prof. So that's my kind of starting point with tax. Just loved it in law school, and so I went to Bay Street right away. I started at Osler, and then I was at Davies, always in tax, just loved it. And this is my origin story, as a summer student, I remember I was doing my rotation in tax, walked into a boardroom with the tax partner that I was sort of following along. I knew absolutely zero, despite having thought I knew more. And there were these tax partners sitting around the table, and there was some big M&A deal happening. I had no idea what they were talking about. And these partners just got up and started drawing on the whiteboard. It was sort of square, circle, blah, blah, blah. Well, no, not that, this. And they, again, zero idea what they were talking about. But they came away with this picture, and they all yeah, well, what about this? What about that? Yeah, that's it. That's what we're going to do. That picture somehow made its way over to the poor corporate M&A lawyers, such as yourselves, who then had to kind of quote unquote paper it. Of course, there's more to it than that. It was a real deal and stuff. But I just love that. I love that creative process, but again, grounded in statute with actual rules that you could follow, that came out with this really creative, cool solution that then was how that deal was done. So that was, sorry, probably not exactly your question about did I start out as an accountant, but that's kind of how I started in tax law and why I love it so much to this day.
I would like to just interject with a broader point, because this was something I was just saying in my corporate transactions class the other day. I was a history major in university, and then I went on to become an M&A lawyer. And when I was in law school, I took an accounting course, and it was the single most practically useful course that I took in law school, and it wasn't even a law class. So I do recommend, and I was not a tax lawyer; I was an M&A lawyer in practice, but I just found it very useful just in terms of being able to read a balance sheet, kind of understand what clients are telling you, being able to speak their language without them having to go through the pain of kind of explaining basic accounting concepts to you. So I know that there's an accounting course that's offered, if not every year, it's offered most years here at this law school. So if you're interested in transactional law or tax law for that matter, I would definitely recommend looking into it. And if that doesn't fit your schedule, just even like before you article, like that summer, whatever, just getting like accounting for dummies or something and just learning basic accounting concepts, I think I think that will be helpful in your practice career.
Sounds like you're pitching yourself.
I would just echo that because that's what a lot of your internal clients, in our case, the business teams, are actually fighting about when they're negotiating a deal. Like they don't really care about the quote unquote legal concepts. They want to make sure that the agreements accurately describe their understanding of the business terms. And so they will look to you and they will say, I think I'm paying X% fees. This is how these types of transaction fees are getting treated. Is that right? And they look at you. And now you have to go through the documents and you have to tell them, yes, your understanding is what's shown in the documents, or no. And then you have to go in and draft and revise the documents to make sure that now they say what your business team thinks. So you're essentially that bridge again between what the deal team thinks and what ultimately gets papered and, God forbid, fought about in court later on. So understanding that language is extremely important to add value either as an external counsel or as your internal counsel, kind of helping your deal team navigate the specific transaction.
Yeah, and speaking as a former deal lawyer, when you're drafting like a purchase agreement or you're drafting any agreement, a lot of times what you're doing is you're translating financial concepts into qualitative legal language. And if you don't understand the inputs, it's going to be very difficult to be a good draftsperson. So just echoing what you were saying.
Hope that answered your question.
I got a quick question. Oh, well, thanks for Kimberly and Marita, if I pronounce your name correct. Thanks for introducing us the picture about what a career will be looks like. And Neil, you mentioned a brief history about how Ontario Pension cut their Wall Street service and built their in-house financial service. Do you have anyone would have a name of the book would record this part of the history, or anyone may have a recommendation about the book's name about a day life as a tax lawyer, or how the pension fund being reformed? Just trying to learn more.
There are books. There's one with a really stupid name, and I really shouldn't say that. I remember thinking it was really interesting that she went and wrote it, which is just Merchants of Enterprise. It's just she could have come up with a better name, but it was actually pretty good history. So I recommend that. It's called The Merchants of Enterprise. And then there's a guy who his name is Keith Ambiture, and I would struggle to spell his name right, but I think it's AMBA TSHEER. First name's Keith, KEITH. Keith writes about this a lot. Keith is sort of a bit of a pension evangelist in Canada, and he's written a number of times. He's in a much more sort of simple way about kind of the whole sort of origin of the Canadian pension model. So Keith makes an interesting point because he's advocating for some other changes now. Like it really was just the stars kind of aligned in terms of the right Minister of Finance in Ontario, the right head of the teachers union, just the right people around at the right time were like, let's do this. And it's interesting because there are other changes that should be made as well. Canada's private sector pension retirement system is actually not like we sort of say, oh, our pensions are great. Our public system is very good, but our private system is actually quite costly and inefficient. And Keith keeps making the point. It really just takes a small group of people who want to try and fix that problem to do it. And I think he keeps pointing back to the example of Ontario teachers, where they saw a problem, they felt it was necessary to fix it. You know, just one thing on Ontario teachers, like everybody else, they haven't abandoned Wall Street, or, you know, far from it. I mean, we do very few control deals actually at BCI. We're usually about 30 to 50% direct, but Quadrill does. Quadrill usually has almost all of it for, and these are a bit more complicated things I could get into, but we will rely on those those big sort of, Wall Street's not where they are, but different places. We rely on them a lot for deal flow, and we partner with them, and there's reasons for that, but a lot more of that capital comes directly from us. We pay a lot smaller fees than we used to. It's sort of a kind of more of a hybrid model that we do.
Yeah, so I see the barbarians at the gate. So we should probably wrap things up, but let's give a big round of applause to our four panelists. Thank you very much.